All right. Hello, everyone. I'll go ahead and get started. So welcome. I hope you're having an interesting information day, even though some of these things like this are virtual. I'm Dr. Jeff Saunders from the Department of Psychology. I'm one of the on the faculty in that department, and I'm going to give you a mock lecture. But this is actually this is a part of a lecture I do for one of the Common Core classes. So if you looked at the program structure, you'll know that there's some of the requirements. If you come here are the Common Core courses, and they're kind of a range of interdisciplinary topics. So I teach one of those, and I'm this is like a part some material from one of the lectures I do for that class. So hope you find it interesting. I will, if you have any questions while I'm at it, you can put in the chat box. I might answer right away, or I might get back to it, but it won't distract me, so you're welcome to do that. You can also speak up during the time too. I'm fine with that. And then let's see. Okay, so, and I've got some slides. I'm going to show you some slides. Let me share my screen. So the topic, the title, How We Know What Isn't So. And I stole this title from a book, but I'll come back to that. But let me start with an example. Something you might have heard of, the tongue map. So the idea that different parts of the tongue are sensitive to different flavors. So we have different kinds of receptors, and the idea is our bitter receptors are in a different position in the tongue than the receptors for sour or salty or sweet. So normally in a class, I'd ask for a show of hands. Who's heard of this? I guess I can't do that now, but generally I find that a lot of people have heard of this idea. There's a number of articles that use this idea. I found one, and this is 2012, but I'm sure there's other things. This was about wine tasting, and something about how it changes your experience of tasting wine. So this is out there, this idea, and how might you test this? It's actually pretty easy to test potentially. And I know you came to as a psychology talk, but I'm getting there. If you wanted to test this out, what could you do? You could get maybe some lemon juice and apply it at the tip of your tongue or the sides of your tongue. And the idea would be when you put it on the sides of your tongue, you'll taste the sour. If you put it on the front, you only get the sweet, say. Or maybe you do something that's salty and you only taste it one place. And this is actually, because it's easy and can be done safely, it's a common demo for education. And when I looked this up, I found, for example, public broadcasting in the United States has Zoom activities, and University of Washington has a neuroscience for kids. They describe a possible experiment you can do with this. But one problem is that this is completely wrong. It's totally a myth. It's not true at all. In fact, all the taste receptors you have are evenly distributed throughout the tongue. There's little difference in sensitivity across regions, like very little, and whatever there is has nothing to do with this map. So it's just wrong. And is this a recent finding? It's actually not. It's been known for a long time. One clear study about whether or not different regions of the tongue have different distribution of receptors was done over 40 years ago. The origin was a poorly controlled study that had a kind of interesting drawing that somehow took off. Anyone who's doing modern research knows there's no tongue map. And there's actually a lot of research because people are involved in industry and flavors. They care about receptors in the tongue, and it's a neuroscience topic. And this idea is just not part of modern understanding at all. There's also many news articles that debunk this. So if you search tongue map, you'll probably find a lot of things that are perpetuating it. But you can also, if you say tongue map myth in Google, you'll find lots of articles. And yet I was still able to find some science education websites that presented this idea, and it's still kind of commonly believed, right? So this is an example, and I kind of look out for these for when I teach on this topic, examples of things that people believe that have somehow persisted, even though there's clear knowledge that they're not true. So how we know it isn't so, it's a title from a book by Thomas Gilovich. So he's a psychologist and a researcher, and he wrote a book in this, and I use this book for my teaching. And he got that from a quote. It's not so much the things we don't know that get us in trouble, it's the things we know that just ain't so, right? So the topic I'm going to talk a little about today is, why do false beliefs persist? And specifically cognitive factors. Because, of course, we might have a false belief because someone tells us something is not true, fine. But why, like, in a culture would something like be able to continue to propagate and not die down if it's just not true? And it's something like this example, there's people made efforts to debunk this, right? And so the topic is that there are some things that make it hard to correct false beliefs, both as an individual and kind of as a society. So what about this tongue map myth? It can be easily tested, and in fact, it has been tested many times in demos. It's another reason I kind of like this example. It's something that lots of little experiments have been done if teachers use this. And every time you do it, the evidence would be inconsistent because it's just not true. So how could it persist? But in fact, there's some reasons why it might be hard to, why it might persist. Imagine you try it, and if you want to be a little mean, you could try it on a friend to trick them. But why might the results appear to support theory even if it's not true? Well, one is that your expectations could influence your perception. Maybe it's like, it seems like I can still taste salty here, but maybe it's less salty. Or if the experience is clearly inconsistent, would you conclude that theory is wrong? If you heard this from a reliable source, a teacher or some website, the assumption would be to look for problems with your test. Maybe you did it wrong. Maybe I didn't place it right. Maybe it's individual differences to explain away the contradictory evidence. So there's some natural things we do in how we interpret evidence and perceive it. They can make it hard to dispel a false belief. So why do they persist? I want to talk about a few reasons. Suppose you have some false belief. In principle, exposure to counter evidence might allow you to correct the error. But there's some cognitive factors that interfere. So some factors, and I'm going to just summarize first, but then I'm going to go through a couple of these and explain what I mean by these. Often in case there's an asymmetry in evidence where things that are confirmatory will be more noticeable in some ways. Or just in some things, naturally, the evidence is not symmetric, and that can get people started with false beliefs and make them perpetuate. We also are not necessarily, we can be biased in how we seek information. So a tendency to seek confirmatory evidence, so that could also contribute. And then also bias in interpretation of evidence. So the first 2 points are kind of about what evidence we notice and look for, but then even if we get it, there's some bias how we interpret it. So when you put all this together, it can make it hard to correct a false belief. So let me start with an example of what I mean about sometimes the confirmatory might be more salient, or the idea that there's some asymmetries in what you notice. So imagine, and when I say false beliefs, I'm not meaning like necessarily big beliefs, like whether you believe in God or something, more like things that we think are true, based on our experience, things that we've heard, but we believe they're true because what we've experienced in life seems to go along with it. All right, so suppose I think my roommate is irresponsible and always forgets to wash their dishes. Now, this is something, there'd be lots of relevant evidence. If you've been living with this person for a while, every meal, either the person does or doesn't wash the dishes, right? So you could potentially have hundreds of trials, say, to experience whether or not, hundreds of examples to draw from in your memory, whether or not your roommate tends to clean up after themselves or not, right? But all those examples might not be equal, because imagine Sunday, clean sink, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Oh, again, I can't believe how often my roommate doesn't wash. See, this is an example where if things are going fine, it's not going to be that noticeable. That's business as usual, right? You're in there and the kitchen's clean. You're thinking about your cooking. You're thinking what you're doing later. You come in and see this giant mess here. now that's something noticeable and irritating that's going to stick out. So people wouldn't necessarily be able to kind of in their memory and their perception have the right proportions of it. Even if it's a rare event, you might have a sense it happens all the time. So the idea here is the positive and negative evidence are not equally noticeable. Everything's going smoothly is a non-event, it's not salient. Something highly unpleasant, it's by salient, I mean it captures your attention, right? And the things that capture the attention, so you might get started believing that your roommate is irresponsible. And once you think that, it's going to get reinforced because the ones you're going to notice are going to be these cases that are just naturally more relevant. There's examples of this. I'm not going to put on a slide, but if you ever get the feeling that when you choose a line, you have bad luck and tend to always choose the wrong line that's too long, well, that could be because you're going to notice the cases where it's frustrating, where you accidentally chose a line that turned out to be slow. So things like that. Let's see. Here's another example. So I'm a psychologist, and it actually comes with psychic powers. So I'm going to make a prediction on the first day of Lunar New Year in 2022. It's been a long couple of years. There will be a major earthquake in China. So next year. So this is a specific day, a major event. Right. Okay. Specific prediction would be unlikely to do from chance. It's not like I'm just saying I predict next year someone famous will unexpectedly die. This is a specific time. Is this a good test of my psychic ability? Well, think about what might happen. If there's no earthquake, is most likely, you probably won't ever remember this. In the unlikely situation where it happened to be a major earthquake exactly on that day, it might trigger your memory of like, well, that's really strange. I feel like I remember this guy at Info Day saying something about that, right? So if you went around throwing around a bunch of these things, the ones that might capture attention and be remembered would be the confirmatory ones, right? So that might give you a false sense that somehow I was able to predict things in psychic. I'll give you another example, and this is an experiment. It's a little older, but I kind of like this example. It looked at tested for biases interpretations of Rorschach tests, and it was motivated by the fact that at the time, clinical psychologists were using Rorschach tests, and there were criteria they'd use to interpret. So you show this ink blot, and what do people see? Oh, I see a face with a nose, or I see a dog. And the idea is what people say in these ambiguous images has some meaning, and people had some guidebooks. How do you interpret it? So there are these ideas that this is useful for diagnosing, but studies that tested it empirically found that what clinicians were relying on weren't actually reliable. So Chapman and Chapman tested a possible explanation for this. So the specific case they looked at was the Wheeler Science for Homosexuality. So, this is the 1960s. At the time, it was considered a condition you might need to diagnose. But anyway, so there were signs in a Rorschach test that were supposed to indicate. A lot of people at the time believed there were certain signs that would indicate that people were homosexual. So just to be clear, I don't think that this is a disorder, but this is historical times, right? And it was still an interesting study. So the condition at the time, if people said it looked like something that was part man, part woman, some kind of mixing, or it looks like a dress, like feminine clothing. So these are things that clinicians at the time would thought would be indicators. And when tested empirically, they weren't. And what's the explanation? A possible thing is illusory correlation. And this is what Chapman and Chapman tested for in a study. The idea is that maybe cases where someone either says they're homosexual or presents with that, and then also interprets images using stereotypical words associated with homosexuality, those might be noticeable. So even if it's kind of rare and kind of random, when a person looks at this and sees a dress, that might, something about that might stick out and be more noticeable, kind of like the dirty dishes. And then what might happen is that clinicians might think, oh, I've got a lot of experience and I see there's this correlation here, when really there may be no correlation at all. So that was their hypothesis about why experienced practitioners had the wrong ideas. And they tested for it. by making fake pairings. So they said, let's give people experience, but we're going to manipulate the pairings and then see what people learned. So they had a few conditions. So what they did was I remember the format, but they'd show they give people some information, like he has sexual feelings toward other men, believes other people are plotting against him. So this would be indication of paranoia, homosexuality, depression, right? So they give some properties like this, then show an ink block, and then show how the hypothetical patient interpreted, right? So basically, kind of like let's simulate the experience you might have seeing a lot of patients with different conditions, and then then ask people what signs they think were predictive of different conditions. And they did a number of conditions, but their focus one was homosexuality and the cues that people had previously been using that weren't reliable. And what they found was, even if the fake data, like the data had no actual correlations for any cues, the popular invalid ones that are associated with stereotypes were believed to be predictive. So what I'm showing here is the red line is how often cues were identified as predictive from the kind of Wheeler criteria that kind of fit stereotypes were popular. And the data was constructed so there was zero correlation. 50% of those, on average, 50% of those cues would be identified as predictive by the people, even though they weren't. And the other cues that were also uncorrelated were rarely picked, right? So zero correlation for both types, but the stereotype runs were perceived to be correlated. So they described that as illusory correlation. The idea that, and the reason why you might get that is because some cases are going to stick out more and they may seem like they're more frequent. And they even found the effect was so strong that when they made other cues valid, again, this is fake data, so they can make it however they want. So if they take some other cue like says something about machines, right? You can make it to her every time the card said homosexual, it also said, it looks like a machine to me. And even if it's 100%, people still tended to go with the other cues. So the fit to the stereotype dominated, even when they artificially built it in and have some other cues. And so this idea of illusory correlations. And so in the explanation, you've got something that somehow sticks out. It's kind of something unusual. It fits your stereotypes. It calls attention. You may perceive a correlation even if it's not there. And that's kind of, they demonstrated that people did do that. And that provides the explanation for why maybe a lot of experienced, educated people had the illusion that there was a systematic interpretation of Rorschach tests, even though there wasn't. And there's other examples of this, illusory correlations. Has been demonstrated in other cases. And the general idea would be something kind of asymmetric, something that might stick out. You think it's more common, and now you think there's a relation where there isn't. All right, so that was kind of about like the salience, what will stick out in terms of information. And so that could cause problems. And like in this case, it could help reinforce some, beliefs about stereotypes. I want to show you, try another exercise. It's kind of a little game we're going to do. You're going to discover there's some rule that I'm not telling you that applies to sets of 3 numbers. Some sets satisfy the rule and some don't. And I'll start you off with 1. So 1, 2, 3 fits the rule. Some combinations do and some don't. And suggest another one, and I'll tell you if it fits the rule or not. So you can do in the chat box, suggest another combination of numbers, and I'll tell you, does it fit the rule or not? Two, 4, 6 is a suggestion. Thank you. 2, 4, 6 does satisfy the rule. All right, now someone else wanted to offer one for testing. 0, 0, 0 does not satisfy the rule. Hold on, let's see. 3, 6, 9 does. 2, 4, 8 also does. That one does not. All right. 4, 5, 6 also satisfies the rule, but stop for a minute. All right, so thank you. But here's, let's go back. So I've got a number of examples now. And what I expected to happen, let's see if it did. So the first one was 2, 4, 6, 0, 0, 0 wasn't expecting, but we had a 2, 4, 6, a 3, 6, 9. So from those examples, people might think, oh, maybe it's even steps. Like after 1, 2, 3, and 2, 4, 6, maybe that is even steps. So someone might want to try 3, 6, 9. There's another 3, 6, 9. But I see some people went for, and then 4, 5, 6 is also equal steps increasing. But then I did get these other ones that are like much, much different. And that's what people don't do as often. So you guys didn't show the effect I expected quite as much as what I usually get. But typically what I'll find is people tend to keep suggesting things that they expect to satisfy, right? So the typical what thing that happens is, so the initial one, oh, so I didn't tell you, the rule was just increasing numbers. So actually, because someone chose this, the second to last one here, doing ones like this that don't fit the apparent pattern are actually good things to test. Because if I had said yes to that one, you think, oh, okay, maybe it's not even steps. But the bias that people tend to do is once they get an idea what the pattern is, they'll suggest more things that fit it and get more and more confident. So 2, 4, 6, oh yeah, how about 10, 20, 30, oh yeah. And somehow it feels like you, as you keep suggesting ones that keep fitting, it feels more and more confident. So that was the tendency. And actually, you guys were pretty good in the sense that people did quickly try some other variations. And that's what you'd have to do to discover what the actual rule was, right? This tendency to kind of look for confirmatory is sometimes called confirmation bias. And there's some different things called confirmation bias, but kind of the idea of seeking confirmatory. And the problem is if you keep doing things like 3, 6, 9, 10, 20, 30, it didn't give you opportunity to learn that your guess was wrong in this case. And now this is kind of artificial when I set up, but just to kind of demonstrate the idea. Let's do another one. Suppose I want items for an extroversion scale. So this is common when people are making a scale to measure some psychological thing like extroversion. You can make statements and then people rate whether they agree or disagree. So often it's a 5-point Likert scale where 5 means strongly agree, 1 means strongly disagree. So what I'd like you to do is a few of you volunteer in the chat box, give me an item you could include in the scale. So it's something someone would read and they would say, yes, I agree, or no, I don't disagree. And the goal of the scale is to measure extroversion. I prefer staying home over going out. Okay. Let's see some other examples. Thank you, Hazel. I like talking a lot. Okay. Good one. Thank you. Let's have a couple more. I prefer pizza. I prefer pizza and ice cream. You're kind of messing me now. That one that isn't obviously related to extroversion. I prefer group activity, right? So, all right, so that's good. So we got a couple good examples. I am extroverted. You could do that. I am the life of the party. Okay. How about 2 more? And then we'll look at the pattern here. People often describe me as quiet. I prefer online. Okay, so you guys actually didn't show. All right, so that's enough for now. Talking about those energize me. The general thing I find when I do this is once I've said I want to measure extroversion, tends to get a lot of things that people would agree with. That wasn't actually the very first one you came up was a negative one. So going back to this, I prefer staying at home over going out. That would work fine for an extroversion scale because people who are extroverts might tend to say no to that. And that would give you information. So in a well-done scale, usually there's agree and disagree. But the tendency when I ask this, it tend to be more like I like talking a lot. I prefer group activity. I'm extroverted, I'm the life of the party. So actually a couple of you guys, like I saw when people describe me as quiet, so some negative, but the general thing when I do this demonstration is people usually, you could do presence or absence. I'm often the life of the party, or I often keep, either one of those could be diagnostic. But in most cases, what I find is the bias of people are more likely to come up with things that are agree items. So you showed a little bit of that, but not quite as much as I usually get. And often in class, I'll do it in Moodle, so I get a whole lot, like everyone will enter in the computer. So the tendency is often to say, to most items, for agree. And you wouldn't want to do that if you're really doing a scale, because when I say the extroversion test, people will tend to say things that people tend to agree. So it'd be confirming rather than disconfirming. Now, some of you did say the opposite ones, and that's what you'd actually want to do to, if you really want to measure it. Look for the presence of a trait rather than the absence. So people tend to look for plus extroversion, not the lack of introversion. If I had asked you, done the same thing, but we go back in time and I said, I want to do a test for introversion, the bias would probably be to ask more things that introverts would agree to. So that's another example where people might have this bias, you didn't even realize it's a scale. And even though people kind of commonly understand this idea of extroversion, introversion being opposites on a continuum, once I say a scale for extroversion, think of things you'd agree with. One more example. All right. You want to evaluate, this is true. Cards with an odd number on one side always have a circle on the other side. Right? So if they have an odd one side, they always have a circle on the other. Which cards do I need to flip? So these cards all have two sides. One side's a number and one side's a shape. I want to know if that statement's true. All right, so A. So I have one response A. So A, obviously, yes, we definitely have to flip this. There's one more. All right, so I've got some people saying D, some people A and C. C. All right, so I've got a number of people saying C, but all right, so this it's a trick question, but it's also kind of an idea of how you might be looking for confirmation. This is the most a typical answer, but that's the correct answer. So someone in there mentioned D. So if it's odd, then the circle on the other side. If you think about this, if I flip this over and it's an even number, that's no problem. But if I flip this over and it's a 3, that is a problem. So that's why you actually would have to look at this to evaluate this hypothesis. But this one could only confirm, not disconfirm. So you can flip it over and so an odd one, you might think, oh, there's more evidence. But then maybe people tend to neglect this one a little bit. So this is something I describe as kind of a variant of confirmation bias too. So if this one turns out to be odd, it supports the statement. If it's even, it doesn't matter. But this one you need to know. So the effect is this one is incorrectly treated as additional evidence. This one's often neglected. Right? So these are confirmation. These are some examples. They're a little bit toy examples, but I want to give some things to give the idea. The idea of confirmation bias. This term is also sometimes used for the other effect I'm going to talk about bias interpreting. So people use confirmation bias to mean a number of things, but one thing is the idea of focusing on confirmatory information. And if you're doing that, you might be less likely to expose to evidence that might help you correct something. So I did a couple of demonstrations of the rule discovery where once you have an idea what the rule is, maybe you look for more ones that would confirm. Whereas some of you had the right idea. If I think it's even steps, let's do something that isn't. But that just isn't quite as natural. People have to kind of work to think that way. Or the Wason selection task, that one's tricky. If you've had some math about the logical contrapositive, it's the same idea that proving A implies B, you could say not B implies not A, but it's somehow counterintuitive. It's just not as natural to us. So that's another reason that we might not end up getting exposed to the evidence that could help us correct a false belief. Let's see. And then what if we encounter evidence that clearly contradicts? What do? Do we just accept the new evidence and change our belief? If not, how do we react? The tendency is to apply scrutiny in a selective way, explaining away the contradictory evidence. I'll describe this a study that looked at this. I'm running low on time. If you have to go at 15, it's fine. I'm not going to take too much longer, but so they had two groups for and against the death penalty. And this was in the 70s in the United States when the death penalty had just become legal again and people had strong political opinions about it. if you did this today, it could be for against Trump. Not I'm going to say anything more about that, but it was that kind of thing. It was in the air, so they picked that, and then they constructed reading materials that was carefully balanced, that had kind of equal amount of reading materials that were supportive or against. And what they found was that instead of bringing everyone together, people tended to reinforce their prior beliefs. You might think, let's provide information. Maybe you're really against the death penalty, but I'll give you some information that seems to suggest why maybe it is a good idea, and vice versa. So this is evidence that once people have in their head, even if you present evidence, it didn't help bring people together, right? And an interesting thing is they looked at how it manifested. So people did not mistake the negative evidence as positive. The findings that were against their point, they recognized. They didn't ignore the contradictory evidence. What did they do? They gave the hostile findings more scrutiny. If they believed the death penalty is useful deterrent, they have some other evidence, they would look more closely at that evidence and find problems and came up generally appropriate objections. So the problem wasn't so much that they was ignoring it or not processing, it was more that I'm going to really scrutinize this stuff that's against my prior view, but then maybe accept without much scrutiny the things that I agree with. And that's how, even if you do encounter some evidence that seems against you, it's not necessarily accepted. It first has to pass some hurdle of getting through your scrutiny. Whereas things you already believe are true, you get things that seem to support it, that could be accepted and kind of reinforce it more readily, right? Now, does this happen to scientists? Of course not, especially psychologists. Now, of course, scientists are not immune. These biases are general tendencies, and I don't have time to go into it, but sometimes I discuss some examples like in medicine where educated scientific people perpetuate these false ideas. It's misrepresentation of evidence, a side effect of the mental processing that allows us to adaptively use our knowledge. We want to use what we know to interpret new things, but it means it gets hard to correct things once we get stuck. An example of a science, let me talk about explaining away evidence. Let's say I think vitamin C prevents common colds, which is not true, by the way. It's another one of these common things people believe. So you do an experiment, treatment control groups. If you found a difference, hey, that's confirmatory. Great. If I don't find a difference and I believed it's true, maybe I'll think maybe the dosage was not enough. Maybe I didn't run enough people, right? And actually, you could probably come up with a lot of very plausible reasons why maybe there still is an effect and you didn't observe it this case, right? So the same kind of problem applies. It can make it hard to get unstuck. And this, like the tongue map bits, is something you might think, oh, I must have done it wrong. Maybe it wasn't localized. Maybe some people vary in the positions. All right. So I hope I didn't have a lot of time, but I hope you kind of appreciate this idea that why might some false beliefs persist? It's not just that they're repeated, it's that there's reasons why it can be hard. Sometimes there's asymmetries in whether you notice the evidence or whether you seek evidence. And then even if you do encounter something that would potentially correct it, you could potentially explain it away. People tend to apply selective scrutiny. So there's a number of things that have to be overcome to be able to correct a myth that's out there. Now, scientific advance is a burden, there's an obstacle. How do we get over this and actually advance our scientific knowledge? And I would say that the scientific method and culture that we have that's been developed over time helps counteract these things. So scientific method, the idea we're supposed to test falsifiable predictions, right? The idea that we need to appreciate randomness and use statistics, to be able to try and avoid our intuitions thinking there's a correlation when there isn't, right? There's peer review in a competitive marketplace. So people who have different interpretations, different views, have to review papers so they get out. So I would argue that this is why over time we're in a better situation we are now than before some of these systems. But over time, as a major caveat, you still hear cases where false ideas, I'm sure there's things we believe now, even as scientists, will turn out not to be true. But this whole structure means, like, I honestly believe that modern medicine is on a much better track than what medicine was like for hundreds of years, not because of the dumb people, but you need some of this culture in order to overcome our natural cognitive tendencies. Okay, so that was what I wanted to talk about today. I'll also say, if you want to learn more about this or some other cognitive biases. Here are some good books that are readable and are written by experts like scientists who write for the pop market. So those are some things if you want more. Thanks for your attention. Bye.